We did nothing wrong!
Yeah, we did. We were supposed to fight for people who couldn't fight for themselves.
Okay, folks. Ruth chapter 3 and verse 15 in your King James Bibles. If you will turn there, we'll begin to read out of our most recent edition of the King James Version. And this passage is considered to be one of the most problematic. That is, one of the biggest of the problem texts of the King James Version. And as we will see, common sense and research and honest revisionary work really does answer the problem, and there is no problem. But let's read King James Version, Ruth 3:15, out of our most recent edition of the King James Version. Also he said, bring the veil that thou hast upon thee, and hold it. And when she held it, he measured 6 measures of barley, and laid it on her, and she went into the city. The supposed issue here in this passage is that there's a difference between the translation of the 1611 edition of the King James Version and the 1769 edition of the King James Version. The 1611 of the KJV does say, and he went into the city. And we have right here an actual facsimile copy of the King James Version of 1611, and it does say, and he went into the city, as opposed to, and she went into the city. Dr. White conveys the following. We note that there is a dispute about this passage and how this passage should read that continues to this day. For the NASB has she, while the NIV has he. The King James Controversy, James White, page number 80. Thus, James White would be correct that other translation committees have had their disagreements about this passage. But folks, as we have said many times before, preservation is a process. Psalm chapter 12, verses 6 and 7 is still in the book. The words of the Lord are pure words, as silver tried in a furnace of earth, purified 7 times. Thou shalt keep them, O Lord, thou shalt preserve them from this generation forever. So purity and the preservation of a given text, folks, takes time, period. This is especially true while considering that God is moving through, and God is working through human instrumentality during this whole process. Ultimately, God, the Holy Spirit, guides those of the believing community to fulfill his perfect will. Ultimately, that will, of course, is carried out, and it is fulfilled to full completion. Thus was the case here. This is, once again, the honest work of revisionary process, and is universes apart from intentional alterations and the omissions from the text that we see running rampant throughout these other English translations and these other Greek texts that are not a part of the traditional line of texts. The Hebrew verb vayavo, and you see it up top there, is an imperfect or an incomplete tensed verb. In other words, the tense of the verb has yet to be completely fulfilled, or it has a future action associated with it. It uses, however, the vav consecutive, or also called the vav conversive or the vav inversion. In other words, that first letter right here, the vav, vayavo, or in this case vatavo, which we'll get to in a minute, vayavo has that prefixed vav, and this means that that first letter reverses the tense of the verb. So if it's an imperfect tense verb and it has the vav inversion, it then converts it to a perfect tense, and vice versa. So if it's a perfect tense with the vav, it inverts to an imperfect tense. In other words, it goes from future to past tense or completed action, or completed action to incomplete action or imperfect action with the vav consecutive. So this affects only the tense of the verb, folks, and not the gender of the verb. Thus, the Masoretic text can be translated, however, into English both ways in this passage, and here's why. In the end, contextually speaking, both he and she, Ruth, went into the city. Just use common sense, stay with the text, and do an actual textual analysis of other parallel passages. Read Ruth chapter 2 and verse 18 and Ruth chapter 4 and verse 1, and you will clearly see that there is no problem. The only problem is the gap between the ears of the people who refuse to understand this. And yet, this is not the conclusion of this debate, not in the least relating to this verse, folks, for the Masoretic text does provide additional textual evidence in agreement with the King James Version reading of the 1769, which is the version of the King James Version that most of us use and is the result of honest revisioning. For in the footnotes of Biblia Hebraica Stuttgartensia, in those footnotes of Ruth chapter 3 and verse 15 are noted manuscripts of Ruth that read the Hebrew verb as vatavo, the bottom Hebrew verb that you see here, which changes the imperfect verb's gender to female and translates as, and she went into the city. The finishing work of the revisionary process preserved for us in English by God, working through initially the King James Version translators and the community of believers. And this is all glaringly obvious grammatical work and grammatical research that most modern scholars, just saying, no disrespect intended, should already know how to do themselves and not call attention to a supposed problem with a text where there is no there. There is no problem with this text. And yes, we do have a perfect, purified Psalm chapter 12 text, a God-honored text, a traditional text, a complete text, a well-circulated text, a renowned text from people we can actually identify. With that being said, have a blessed day. Lehitraot, until we meet again. Shalom Aleichem. Peace be unto all.